Welcome to An Audience with ISAA.
Hi guys, hope you're all good. It's a beautiful afternoon here, May afternoon, and glad to be back with An Audience with ISAA. And the last episode was really quite interesting. So that was about personal relationships. That was on cheating. So far, you know, the comments coming back has been fantastic. My new topic, and actually my guest speaker today, couldn't be so far removed from the last one. So this is really exciting as well. And this is about what I really want this show, this interview to be about. It's just got to be about every single topic that potentially affects us. So this topic, I'm as excited as the guest speaker that's going to take us through. And I actually know a lot of millennials are quite interested in it as well. So I'm hoping it gets out of the age range that I would say I tend to appeal to, and you know, we go a little bit further. So just to introduce you into the topic, I've got my guest here. It goes by the name Sijdon, and I want to say the Don has come from the dawn of knowledge. Is someone that I'm very proud of. And, you know, we're going to go through this topic. He's a computer scientist, as it calls it now, a data analyst. And I can only let Sijdon introduce himself a little bit more to us, and then we get into the topic. The topic, by the way, I don't even think I actually mentioned it, is we're looking at conspiracy theories and alarmist views on COVID. And he's got it broken down into different sections about the level of misinformation that seems to be out there. So without much ado, I want to introduce to you guys Sijdon. So Zij, take it away, please.
My name is Zij, short for Sijdon. I am a data scientist. I've been for a while. I'm also into events. We produce concepts and yeah, here in Lagos, Nigeria.
Yeah.
Hopefully someday around the world. So I am very interested in data. I am primarily a data scientist, and it does interest me to you know, look around and see what's going on, especially through data. Yeah. So the topic today is mainly based around conspiracy theories surrounding COVID-19.
Right.
Some of them. It's caused by 5G. It was created in a lab, or it escaped from the lab. It's a hoax. It doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
Rumors are inflated, or I mean, you know, similar to the second and third points. It was created by some military.
Right.
So we've all heard these at some point. So,
Yes.
I find them to be unhelpful. I find that it is very, very important to understand why they are dangerous.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, for over 10 years now, I've been hearing warnings. Scientists have warned about pandemics such as these.
Okay.
And these are due to a number of reasons. And the first and foremost is air travel. There are over 100,000 flights a day.
Wow.
Whenever there's an outbreak of something such as this, it is very, very easy to, you know, to spread it around the world.
Yeah.
Just because there's so many flights going from so many places. I mean, in under 2 or 3 days, it's possible for something to go, you know, right around the world.
Yeah.
Just that. They also happen because as human beings, we have a lot of habits and attitudes that, you know, that are not really suited to what we're living.
Yeah.
We all, you know, collectively touch our faces a lot.
Yeah.
Most of us don't wash our hands regularly, at least not as often as we should.
Yeah.
So
if I just stop you right there, just to get into it, you started really building an interesting picture, and it's so funny. Well, the funny is probably not the right word. It comes as a surprise that something that we regard now as normal, hair travel, you know, is such a normal part of our lives. Either you're going short distance, you're going long distance, but really, it's never been. It's one of the reasons things like this will spread really fast, but we just never gave any cognizance to it. And then you mentioned hygiene, so I would ask you a question. Would you say that basic hygiene pre-COVID was actually really bad?
Yeah, I definitely say that.
Wow.
So I feel like, take for example, just like I've said that I've known people, for over 10 years complaining about it. I've also known people for over 10 years that, walk around with a hand sanitizer in their pocket.
Yes.
Every time. We all know someone like that.
Yes.
And we all always thought where, that's just a bit too.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's not. So these people know, or at least at then knew exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
We come in contact with a lot of terrible things all the time. We all go to have a sandwich, and most of us don't wash our hands before we eat the sandwich.
Wow.
All the things touched all day, all the hands you've shaken, all the surfaces you've touched.
Yes.
And then you pick up your sandwich just like that.
Yeah.
I mean, some people don't even have it covered with the paper. They are quite content to just hold it directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
For a long time we've been we've had these habits that are not really suited to the world.
Yes. Yes.
Being convincing people of that. I mean, I've been hearing for a long time, but I've also spoken to people who have never heard.
Yes.
Who know that you're not supposed to touch your face. Or
Yes.
to your hands as often as you can.
Wow. It just leads me on to a further question, and I'm sure you'll correct me as in terms of if it's misinformation. If, as scientists, you guys have been aware of, a potential for an outbreak like this in the last 10 years, I wonder why the governments of the world, and, if I may say, like the Western government, for example, who seem to act, at least I feel like they're a bit more proactive on medical information. Why have people been so silent? Why have governments been so silent about it?
So yeah, I mean that's. I guess there is some social aspect to having to tell people to wash their hands or things like that. I don't know. Maybe they just feel. I mean, because there are other things that they've been doing.
Yes.
That, right. So like, let's take for example. The two main fears with scientists have always been either viral outbreak, like
yes,
now,
yeah,
or bacterial outbreaks.
Yes.
So when it comes to bacteria, these are a little different. So unlike viruses, bacteria we're actually familiar with.
Yes.
I mean, also viruses as well. They're deadly, they're bad. When you look at Ebola, HIV, they're all viruses.
Yes.
But we are more intimately familiar with bacteria.
Right. Right.
Where bacteria kill a lot of people. You get a paper cut, then you get an infection.
Yes.
Most likely, a lot of women died during childbirth.
Yeah.
Because of bacteria.
Okay.
For the invention of antibacterial.
Yes.
Penicillin, I'm sure there's been mentioned before that.
Yes.
Agreed. Penicillin, 1928, first of antibiotic invented or discovered. Now, this really helped humans a lot because people were now not dying from infections they most likely would have died of.
Yes. Yeah.
Because of that, we come to abuse antibacterial because bacteria they are living things as well. If they are awake, they adapt.
Yeah.
The more you use something, so there's an overprescription of antibacterials for things. You take them for even things that they're not meant for. People take them for the flu. I mean, flus are viruses, but you can't use an antibacterial for.
Yes.
What people do, we take them for no reason and for any reason.
Can I mention an interesting fact? And I know, we're obviously both from Nigeria, and we know how our people like to abuse prescription drugs. Every single person, almost every household. I think maybe less of the younger generation, but I would definitely say from 35 and above feels like they're doctors and nurses, and they can prescribe assorted, drugs for themselves. So it's one of the things. So we've definitely abused penicillin and antibiotics. Yeah.
So the danger now is scientists started to notice bacteria.
Yeah.
Are now starting to have immunity. That they are now immune to most antibacterial drugs.
Yeah.
They call it superbugs.
Yeah.
So for a long time, so they had this antibiotics that are rarely used, usually because they have really terrible side effects.
Yes.
An example of it, so because of this is almost never used. They only use it as the last resort medicine.
Yes.
So we found that these drugs still offer bacteria that are immune to most other antibiotics.
Yes.
However, some years ago, they discovered that some Chinese pig farms have been using this drug to treat bacterial infections amongst their pigs.
Oh wow!
So now we are seeing a rise of bacteria that are now immune to even that antibiotic. So because of this, that is also a danger.
Yes.
We are slowly approaching the time, just like hundreds of years ago, where bacteria were a major danger to us. Pretty much every country in the world has been reporting an increase in bacterial infections
Yes.
that are immune to antibiotics. So this in connection with viruses have always sort of been the worry.
Really, it's from the bacteria, just taking bacteria itself and without combining it with the viruses. A lot of what we eat, because if pig farmers can be injecting antibacterial into their pigs to keep them healthy, what would we say, would that be a lot also in mechanized farming? Because
Yeah, absolutely. So the more the world's population grows,
yes,
and the more there is a demand for meat, and the more the producers need to keep the prices down.
yes. So it's it's effectively mass production on steroids, isn't it?
A burger has to cost $1.
Yes.
So because of that, we have to keep packing these animals tighter and tighter towards each other.
Yes.
And that increases the chances of them exchanging these movies and viruses and things that can eventually threaten the human population.
Get into what are the things that we will have to think about post-COVID, but I know you're just explaining why we've come about this now, trying to give plausibility to, it wasn't just in a lab, it's also because of human behavior over time is how we've ended up in this situation effectively.
Absolutely. I think in many ways this COVID-19 is obviously very terrible. A lot of people are dying.
Yes.
But I also feel like it's a good introduction.
Yes.
It's a good way for everyone to know what's out there.
Yeah.
That there are out there how to keep. And I feel like as far as outbreaks go,
Yes.
it could have been a lot more. It has although it has a really high infection rate.
Yes.
It has a very low fatality.
Yes.
And I feel like it could have been a lot worse. And so this is a very, very good introduction for people to know to wash our hands.
Yes.
Try to limit the number of times we touch our faces. We as a community need to be better about our hygiene. We need
Yes.
to, we all need to be more interested in science and,
Yes.
Try to encourage or inspire kids to do more science.
Yes.
To try to find solutions to these problems.
That's a fantastic point. That's a great point, actually. So there's got to, we as humans, we've conquered our environments because we've utilized our brains, and I guess people like you that are scientists through and through will look through how you can actually put solutions out there to help us with all these issues that we're coming across. So just to, because you've talked about, so we've cleared now the misinformation part of COVID, and interestingly, I went and looked up the word disinformation to make sure I could separate the two. So disinformation, it's about propaganda. It's about actually people misleading. Can you sort of give a little bit lead into why would people want to so disinform people about this? What is there to gain?
I was looking this up the other day.
Yes.
And it turns out that some disinformation campaigns happen as a result of maybe someone was, for whatever reason, the person was joking on social media.
Yeah.
And people sort of run with it. Because as human beings, we like to do things that look nice.
Yes.
It's a screenshot of something. It tells a really nice story, and it's nice to share. Like to share things.
Yes.
Some are as a result of people having agendas. So there's a lot of so like one of those hoaxes has been. We don't really know if this is true, but it was the virus was manufactured in a lab.
Yes.
And some feel that to combat that, some in China allegedly are also putting out their own disinformation.
Yes.
Saying it was invented by the U.S. military.
Oh wow.
In China.
Yeah.
So you can see that that there are agendas there.
Yes.
There are other reasons why they need people to believe certain things about them.
Yeah.
And about the outbreak.
Mm-hmm.
And some people just like to say, and I guess some people truly believe that.
Yeah.
Some people really believe it makes sense to them, maybe based on their other world experience. They've come to believe the worst in governments. And don't get me wrong, governments have been known to be, terrible as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you are quite right, because at the end of the day, it was just an interesting perspective. There's one thing we're very clear of is, everybody has an agenda. It just means the agenda could just be malignant, or it just could be benign, as in it's not going to have an effect on. But you do have to. There is that bit about conspiracy theorists that comes from the interplay between China and America, because currently they're the world leaders in certainly in almost everything, in technology, in the arms race, in actually in development. We need to be quite fair. So where you've got that competition, there's going to be a level of disinformation. So I think it's accepted, and I would actually appeal to people that this is where, and you stated it previously, this is where people have to actually develop their own knowledge, be confident in being able to decipher between what is right and what is wrong. And actually, how can you do that? There has to be some scientific basis. There has to be reasoning. So yes, thank you so much for that, Shiju. That's really quite good. That's a really very interesting points actually about what we should take away, well, in terms of what we need to take away from this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I mean, even news organizations,
Yes.
they also tell stories.
Yes.
According to their worldviews or the worldviews from where they come from.
Yeah.
No, like it is very, very difficult, except maybe in science.
Yes.
To read the entry, yes, and unbiased.
Okay.
Sort of
Fantastic.
And that's because in that field or in that community,
Yeah.
it is the process to try to present things as objectively as you possibly can.
Yes.
So, well, in everyday everything else, you don't get that unbiased view. Everyone
Yes.
has some sort of agenda, whether knowingly or unknowingly,
Yeah.
whether conscious or not.
Hmm.
They are trying to convince you of something, of a worldview that they hold. So
Yes.
it is very important to always try to understand the situation from as many sources as you possibly can.
Yes.
Maybe even from sources that you don't necessarily agree with. And
Yeah.
the hope is that
Mm.
somewhere in there you can start to form your own conclusions.
Yes. Yes.
And also when a view is presented to you, it is also your responsibility to ask as best as you can for proof, for
Yes.
evidence.
Clarification.
Exactly. Why do you believe what you believe, and why should I believe?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow, fantastic. It's really brilliant. And people will be less taken in if they're prepared to ask questions and to challenge back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because in the process of dialogue and back and forth, we will get closer and closer to the truth.
So, Shiju, thank you so much so far. I mean, it's been really good to hear that whilst it's easy for us to just believe, COVID is as a result of some dastardly act by China or by America or, from a lab, it's actually because, as humans, we're potentially responsible for the situation we found ourselves. So I'm hoping people digest that as it goes on. Yeah, so...
I mean, it is most likely easier. It's a much easier explanation.
Yes.
Than something more, like something complex, like personal hygiene, antibiotics, and all of that. It's
Yeah.
much easier. It was made. And
Yeah.
as you like simple explanation.
Yes, very true. Very true. Wow.
Go on with the rest of our lives.
Yeah. We'll be coming out of it obviously a lot better. So are there, round this topic that we've chosen, are there more interesting facts or perspectives that you can share with us that would, help each and every one of us really?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I mentioned earlier to sort of encourage our kids to go more into science is
Yeah.
that as we can see from an outbreak such as this, like the response to it could have been better.
Yes.
Even though there have been news about this for a long time, we still haven't responded to it as well as we could have. I mean, anything can always be better.
Yes.
Apparently, no new antibiotics have been discovered since the 80s. So it is very important for more people to get involved in the fight, to learn more science and get more into research and as I said before, try to find solutions to this problem.
Yes. It's the 80s. So is that because we believe every variant of antibiotics we've got currently could deal with the whole total scenarios that may come about? Or it's just or as a result of underfunding? Because it's very difficult to believe with a number of biochemists and advancements in biotechnology that actually we haven't really had much progress over 30 years in coming up with new medicines to actually save us from viruses and bacterias?
So yeah, absolutely. I'm sure funding has something to do with it. I'm sure it also shows that more people need to get involved. So now, oddly enough, the person who discovered antibiotics actually warned about the the development of bacteria that are immune to
Yes.
antibiotics. When so yeah, so it's been known for a while. I believe it's just more people just need to get involved. More money needs to be spent on to fund research.
Yes.
Things like that. Or mostly it's just about getting more people in there, just getting more people from diverse cultures and everything.
Yeah.
With different perspectives.
Yes. I have a very interesting question for you, actually. So, and it's actually is an offshoot of you saying since the 80s. Question for you, actually, which is quite interesting, as an offshoot of no new antibiotics have been discovered or maybe effective and on the market since the 80s. What is your take on African herbal medicine? Because I'll go back to that. What is your take, especially given what we've seen in the last 6-7 weeks of fighting the pandemic, of fighting COVID? How can we make that more scientific? And what have you, in your experience, seen that can help us progress on that front?
One of the things going around at the moment is on like the Nigerian African social media.
Yes.
Is that matter, for example, that they have no deaths from the COVID, but that's because they have some local herbal medicine they're using.
Yes.
That it helps the virus. I mean, so I think at the end of the day, science is about testing. If those things are real, if they're true, they just need to test them out, have trials the way they do.
Yes. Yes.
And why don't no one is listening to them
Yes.
when they say that? Is because when you say this thing works, and you just say, "Oh, I tried it on 10 people and it worked," no one's gonna take your word for it. It's unreasonable to even expect that. Or if you did trials and you document the process you took,
Yes.
to push through and they all sound.
Yes.
Then people will believe, because scientific trials are all about people being able to reproduce what you did.
Yeah.
So yes, like if there are herbal medicines that work, I mean I don't know that they don't. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if they do, then have trials, document the process, make it so that somebody else can say, you know what, I will repeat what you just did.
Yeah.
And it does work as well. No one will ignore you if you publish like something that shows that this thing definitely works.
Yes.
So yes, if those things work, I mean, at this point, everything else, nothing else works.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting though. I think it's worth taking forward, and I don't know, obviously you're in Nigeria, it's worth, and I'm sure a lot of bioscientists and chemists, etc., effectively what you're saying is, the reason people don't believe in it, or the reason we don't know if it works or not, is because, it hasn't been vigorously tested through where you can say, right, this is just like paracetamol. Everybody knows if you take 2 paracetamols of a certain dosage, that should reduce your headache. So we need to get herbal medicines to that point as well. And maybe that's the next frontier of scientific research. And maybe that's the way we can counter a lot of this viral and bacterial issues that we currently have. Because I will say something, is obviously the world has slowed down in the last 7 to 8 weeks because we've had a pandemic. But at some point, we're going to have to start galloping again. Maybe not as fast as we were previously, but we're going to have to. So there has to be solutions in place,
Exactly. And this thing is like one of the points have been like one of the reasons why, coming back to the original title.
Yes.
Is that this is a new reality. This is the world we live in today.
Yes.
Things are going to start happening more frequently. As a matter of fact, they should have been happening
Yes.
So yes, so it would definitely be helpful to start looking for alternative ways, other ways that work.
Yes. Yes.
Test it.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe this is an opportunity for our scientists, for
Yes.
our biochemists,
Yes.
not to try those, look at them, test them.
Yes.
But I guess that also comes back down to funding. Again,
Yes. Yes.
our billionaires, our rich people.
Yes. Yeah. You're very right. I was going to just come on to that point. Is you know, we can't continue to look to the West for solutions. Discussions like this, you know, amongst eminent scientists, amongst technocrats, government officials, that it's actually backed by funding. I mean, funding, at the end of the day, no matter what you want to say, funding is the basis for which you're going to get progress, that you're going to get technological advancement. And leading on to one of the things you do, I know you're an AI expert, and you write quite a lot of programs in terms of trying to reduce what do we call it, human machine learnings and stuff like that. So how can this also maybe assist towards a future projection?
Yeah, I mean it does. It has happened in the past. So there was a study released some weeks ago where someone used an AI model. So AI, basically put as simply as possible, AI is teaching computers to learn patterns so as to be able to then make decisions.
Yes.
So it was published a few weeks ago, just at the start of the outbreak.
Yeah.
There's some people AI to sort of scan all the drugs, all the known approved drugs,
Yes.
to see are most likely to have an effect.
Yes.
So there's been a drug in the news recently, remdesivir.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I believe this was one of the drugs they found that might work, and that was what started the trials.
Right.
Remdesivir
Yes.
was for last week that it seems to have some effects. They're not entirely sure yet. It's still all very new.
Yes.
But yes, it is the one drug we need to sort of help if it's taken early enough at the start of the COVID-19
Yes.
illness.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, there was also another study published recently where some people were able to use AI images of a person's X-ray
Yes.
to see where COVID-19 is in the lungs and things like that.
Oh wow. Okay.
AI does play a part in everything pretty much, and
Yeah.
has played a part here as well.
Mm.
So yeah, it is another interesting area to get into.
Okay.
Because the way it's moving, it's by itself, it's becoming like tech.
Yes.
It's starting to get it's infusing itself into all other aspects.
Yes.
So it's going to be that kind of skill where it would be helpful to know in addition to anything else we know. Definitely.
Right. Right. Brilliant. This has really been a very interesting discussion, because your agenda, as I know, it's actually was to inform people about learning not to make excuses, really, which is what it is be aware of how your behavior affects the world, and not only be aware of how your behavior affects the world, be also ready to put yourself out there as one of the solutions to the world issues. And you've really come across very well on that, and it's one of the things I want to espouse with whatever I can, with the little resources I have, is always be ready to be, you know, a solution to a problem. Always be ready to be a part of discovering something new, and just always be able to be positive about a situation. So hoaxing around COVID, spreading disinformation, misleading others, actually maybe potentially misleading yourself about the situations, and people given to what would I say, to dramatization of an issue as opposed to finding a solution for it, should really put a sock in it and just try and be positive. Would you say that's a fair description of what you've wanted to, what you've wanted to impart to people by this interview? Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, especially when it is of no help.
Yes.
Great man Bill Gates said recently. He said at this point of the pandemic, it doesn't even matter whether it was made in a lab. Knowing whether or not it was made in a lab does not help us solve this problem
Yes.
at this moment. We can talk about it afterwards. And but the fact is there is a pandemic right now.
Yes.
Let's try to, and knowing whether or not it was made in a lab will not help solve it.
Yes.
At this very moment. But
Yeah.
yes, that's yeah, in a nutshell.
Right. Thank you so much. Really appreciated the conversation. Lovely topic. I really enjoyed it. I'm hoping at some point you'll come back again when you've got more discoveries for us. And I can only wish you the very best in getting a lot of our youth into the science arena, and also getting them to practicalize what they've learned, because you're living testimony actually about how you have applied science to what you do. You know, I know you're the CTO of your startup, and you've participated in so many, you've participated in so many events, which has actually all been powered by technology. So I continue to wish you the very best as you actually open up, you know, Africa, and you open up emerging countries to what technology can do. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.